Alright, so moving along, chapter 2, ready, set, here we go. A paradigm's basically like a worldview. It's a perspective through which we make sense of the world, informed by our norms and values and some assumptions we make about the world. So if you take something like freedom of speech as an example, under the free speech paradigm, we feel pretty secure in expressing ourselves to the extent that much of our identity is actually wrapped up in personal expression. Things we say, what we do, our fashions, slogans that we wear on our t-shirts, how we style our hair, music we sing along to, and so on and so forth, So all of this stuff, the way we express ourselves, tells people who we are and what we're all about. And according to our free speech paradigm, we have every right to be ourselves and to express ourselves. However, under a different cultural paradigm, let's say in rural Pakistan, individual self-expression is not part of that worldview. Instead, people are understood in a far more relational way. You're either somebody's son or daughter or brother or sister or, a cousin or parents or children. The way you express yourself is not an expression of you as an individual necessarily, but an expression of your entire family and your entire community, actually. Therefore, there's more of a politics of respectability in rural Pakistani paradigm than there is, let's say, in an American paradigm. They don't have necessarily this value that they place on free speech, right? And it doesn't make sense in that context. Right? Practice of free speech for a rural Pakistani could actually cause a lot of trouble, not just for the individual, but also for their family and their community. So here's the thing, right? It's very easy to get stuck in your own paradigm. Most of us have lived in North America, pretty much our entire lives. And from that perspective, you might be tempted to say, oh man, those poor Pakistani people, they can't really express themselves. Right? They can't be themselves, and why can't they just be more like us, But that's a mistake, right? And similarly, they may say, oh, those poor American people must be so shallow, thinking only of themselves all the time, and they have no sense of community or ties to family, and that's also a mistake, right? And we should avoid making these kinds of cross-paradigm criticisms. We don't judge another paradigm based on the norms that we apply to our own. Instead, we need to kind of understand the values and assumptions and things that inform that paradigm in order to relate to the people that are in it, right? And so I just wanted to kind of use that as an example, as a way to get into quantitative and qualitative research as paradigms. These are two very different approaches to research. And it's an important point that I'm going to repeat over and over again in this class. Quantitative and qualitative research are not just two different ways of doing research. They're two different ways of thinking about doing research. And the norms and values and assumptions that govern quantitative research don't necessarily apply to qualitative research, and vice versa. So, now most people, as a function of their personality, tend to be more drawn towards one paradigm over the other. So if you enjoy working with numbers and coming to very specific, concrete conclusions, then you're probably going to be more drawn towards a quantitative paradigm or worldview. If you're more interested in sort of an open-ended exploration of people's stories, their experiences, and you're kind of comfortable with some ambiguity in things, then you're probably going to be more drawn to the qualitative side of things. Johnson and Christensen, the textbook authors, they're very clearly quantitative guys, sometimes frustratingly so, in my opinion, especially when we get to some of the qualitative material in the book. Personally, I'm more aligned to the qualitative perspective or paradigm. But it's not really a matter of pledging allegiance and saying everything qualitative is great and anything quantitative is not so great. That's not really how we need to approach research paradigms. Both of the paradigms provide us with very important perspectives on a topic, and they're different perspectives. From a holistic point of view, if you're doing a literature review or reading, about a topic, then yes, you want to have both sides represented. You want to be fully informed about the topic. And whatever your preference is, whether you're quant or qual, you should at least have a firm grounding in the basics of both methodologies so that you understand some of the information that you might come across. Unfortunately, there's been a history of this kind of dismissiveness between the paradigms. This is what was known as the paradigm wars. But in the beginning, or at least since like the Age of Reason, which is about 1700s or so, there was logical positivism, which was the name of the paradigm. And logical positivism relied on objectivity and observable or empirical evidence to understand the mechanics of the universe, which included human behavior. So that's where the whole saying, like, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist, came from, which I don't think is very true or useful. And we also got the scientific method, which is actually quite useful. So logical positivism pretty much ruled research for like hundreds of years. But sometime around like the middle of the 20th century or so, there were critics of logical positivism, and they're pointing out like the limitations of this approach in generating knowledge, particularly where logical positivism was positioned as the sole authority of knowledge. There are other kinds of knowledge that exist, like personal subjective experience, which science wasn't very good at describing. So, drawing on like thinkers from disciplines like literature or philosophy or anthropology was a big one. Journalistic studies, there eventually developed an approach which was called qualitative research, sort of an alternative to the typical quantitative or logical positivist research that had been done for hundreds of years. The establishment, the quantitative researchers, however, weren't very accepting of qualitative research sort of stepping on their turf. They kind of fought back. They accused it of lacking rigor, being junk. Basically, they didn't see a lot of value in people telling stories or, anecdotes and things like that. That was kind of the criticism that was lobbied against the qualitative researchers. And qual researchers, on the other hand, tended to kind of use postmodernism, which we'll talk about later, to deconstruct, sort of the whole process of producing knowledge, how that was sort of tied into power structures and things, which comes out of people like Foucault, who you might have heard of. And it was a means of social control and discipline. So for 20 years, they kind of went back and forth, a lot of bickering and fighting, which, it sounds kind of funny, but, there were serious consequences. Professors, would lose or gain tenure over these kinds of things, and they would bicker back and forth at research conferences and stuff. It was kind of serious for a bit. But by, the late 1980s, early 90s, that whole war had kind of exhausted itself. Most people kind of had reached the point where they said, okay, quantitative and qualitative research both have values. They bring kind of unique and complementary perspectives to a topic. And so we can coexist peacefully, And so that's sort of where things stand today, is we have sort of a peaceful coexistence. If there's one beneficial thing that came from all these paradigm wars, it's that it forced both methodologies to kind of tighten up their rigor and, to admit some of their limitations. So I think probably as a result, we have better versions of quantitative and qualitative research than we would have had maybe 30 or 40 years ago. So now the war is over, right? That's great. What we see now happening now is that there are some researchers who are making attempts to actually unify the two methods under a single sort of mixed methods approach. And it's varying degrees of success. I think there are different opinions about mixed methods, and you're going to find that I'm going to own my opinion right now. I'm skeptical, actually, of mixed methods. I think Johnson and Christensen, the way that they present them, they're too easily dismissive of this incompatibility hypothesis. But there are some valid criticisms that maybe, you as students learning about these approaches should actually consider. So if you open up your text, right, and flip over to table 2.1, you'll see there's three columns. In the first column, I think there's quantitative, and then the mixed methods is in the middle, and then qualitative is on the other side. So if you wanted to just sort of ignore that middle column, you can put a piece of paper over it or something, and just look at quantitative and qualitative. What you'll see is that a lot of that is actually very contradictory. Quantitative operates from a objective perspective, whereas qualitative operates from more of a subjective perspective. Well, how can you be objective and subjective at the same time, right? That doesn't really work. Quant uses numbers, and qual uses more descriptive text. Quant believes that people are regular and predictable. Qualitative believes they're unique and dynamic and contextual. And the thing is, if you try to view the world through a narrow angle lens and a wide angle lens at the same time, that's not going to work. You're only going to end up with blurry vision and a headache, right? So I don't think that they're as compatible as maybe Johnson and Christensen kind of make them out to be. But that's also not to say that you can't combine these methods, that it's impossible. There are actually some quality mixed method studies out there, but they're far more difficult to do than you might suspect. So you shouldn't be fooled by this sort of best of both worlds sales pitch that a lot of advocates of mixed methods often propose. The best of both worlds is really a stupid rationale for doing research or selecting a methodology. But in order to understand why it's stupid, I think we need to look a little bit at the research process. The process of doing a study, if we take it from the very beginning, you're probably going to be interested in a topic, right? There's something that you're curious about, or something that you want to know about, or something you're just interested in, For me, I was interested in working with addicted clients, right? You might be interested in older students who have returned to school, being in the middle of a career change, which is kind of an interesting topic, I think. But you're going to want to do sort of a review of the existing literature to see what's actually been written about it so far, where the research stands presently. So as you're reading, you're learning about the population, you might find you have some questions or curiosities that are coming up for you that haven't been answered by the literature that you're reading. You might be interested in whether second career students, right, are more likely or less likely to complete a bachelor's degree than more traditional students, 18 or 19-year-olds. This is your research question, and this is going to drive everything else in your study. Everything is going to be aimed at answering this question. Therefore, when you select a methodology, you're basically trying to select the methodology that's going to be most appropriate for answering this question. If you've stated your question clearly and correctly, then that's not really a choice. The methodology is not really a choice. It's going to flow naturally from the question that you've asked. So if we take our example of the second career students, right? This is it's a quantitative research question. We have an independent variable, which is the type of student, either the second career student or the traditional student. And we have a dependent variable, which is completion rates, of the undergraduate degree, a bachelor's degree, So we want to look at the relationship between these variables, which makes it a quantitative question, right? We're going to apply a quantitative methodology to this question. There's no room here for, qualitative research. There's no need for it, right? That's not going to help us answer the question. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about research questions and variables and things later, so if you're not getting that now, we'll get to that in a little bit. So if your research question can go in several different directions, and maybe it's quantitative, and maybe I can fit in qualitative and all this other stuff, then it's probably not a very clear question to begin with. You're probably trying to do way too much with your research, and that's going to get really overwhelming. You shouldn't try to pursue just every direction all at once. It's way too much work to do, and your study will just never end. The best thing to do in that case is just revise your question so you're very clear on what it is that you're actually asking, what it is you're actually trying to find out. So keep in mind, like, this particular study on second career students isn't going to be the only study ever done on second career students. Nobody ever sets out with this idea of, I'm going to do a study and it's going to answer every question anybody could have on the topic for all time, right? That's just way too much to take on, and it's going to be terribly overwhelming. Instead, researchers tend to focus on a very narrow and specific research question that they're trying to answer, and the study is designed to answer that question. And then once it's over, another question comes up and another study is done, and so on and so on. People build entire careers studying just very few topics, and variations on those topics, several questions around a specific topic. So in our example, with the second career students versus traditional students, it's a quantitative research question, which means we're going to have a quantitative research design. We're going to figure out a rigorous way to collect our data, including sort of a way to process all of the data or analyze it. Then we're going to put all of our plans into motion, and go out and actually do the research, collect all of the information and process it. And finally, we, write everything up, and try and get it published in a journal or something. So on the face of it, it's a fairly straightforward process. But there's no room for best of both worlds, It's all of it flows fairly naturally from the question. So what often happens, and this is not, necessarily the way that it's intended to happen, but what often happens in mixed methods research, especially when you use this best of both worlds rationale, is one of two things, really. Either they're basically two separate studies guided by two separate research questions, which may or may not be kind of related, but basically you're doing two separate studies. Or you end up with one study where you have mostly, one methodology being used, and then the other is sort of thrown in there superficially as sort of this fluff method. And neither of those is, a proper mixed method study. So with our second career student example, right, pretty straightforward. Basically I would look at graduation percentages or graduation rates and see who graduates and who drops out, and then compare those numbers. That's a really, really simple kind of example, right? Now, if I was doing this best of both worlds, rationale, I might add like an open-ended survey to look at motivation. Well, first of all, motivation for graduating is a different thing than I was initially planning to study, right? It's not graduation rates, it's motivation. That's two different things. And then secondly, using an open-ended study for qualitative research, as we'll find out later, is a really bad idea. It's just not the way to collect qualitative data. But sometimes that's what will happen in mixed methods research, is they put a few open-ended questions to their participants, and all of a sudden they think they're doing qualitative research. It's not. As I was saying earlier, I'm not opposed to mixed methods in general. There's nothing wrong with mixed methods. What I'm opposed to is this idea of the best of both worlds rationale and just kind of mashing them together in a way that's not so rigorous. Mixed methods can produce some pretty quality research as long as the methodology is justified by the research question. So let's change our research question to something that would be more appropriate for like a mixed method study. Let's say that we're, instead of looking at graduation rates between second career and traditional students, maybe we're looking at how the professional identity development influences the motivation to graduate in second career students and in traditional students, and sort of juxtaposing those. Obviously that's not as simple. It's a far more complex question that's going to require us to use mixed methods. Can't be answered by just quantitative research or qualitative research alone. We need to actually combine them. So in this case, I'd probably track the students over the degrees, doing sort of assessments on professional identity at regular intervals and motivation at regular intervals. And then I'd probably also do like in-depth interviews to find out how they're experiencing the program, how they understand professional identity, and what their motivation is to graduate. So I'd have numeric information that would support the qualitative data, and I'd have qualitative information or qualitative data that would support the quantitative conclusions and things. And so they would really work together to answer my research question. And that could be a very interesting study. But I think it's clear that it's also far, far more work than just doing like a quantitative or qualitative study on its own. And as a researcher, I would need to figure out how all these pieces combine in a sort of unified way, which I wouldn't have to do if it was just collecting numeric data or qualitative data. So I have one final thing I'm going to say about the mixed methods, then I'll stop complaining about them for a little while. In order to do a good mixed method study, you need to have a good understanding of both quantitative and qualitative research. And remember I said like people are naturally drawn to one or the other. For mixed methods, you need to be strong in both. You can't just jump into a mixed method study if you're weak in one or the other approach. In fact, usually what happens with mixed method studies is they're not done by an individual person, but they're done by teams or groups of researchers. And each of them sort of bring their own specific talents to the project. My advice for those of you who are new to research and just learning about it for the first time is to focus on learning about quantitative and qualitative separately before you try to mix them together. I mean, if you don't understand them, then you're not going to be able to do a mixed method study anyway. Okay, so moving on, we're going to look at variables. Now these are the basic building blocks of quantitative research. There's no such thing as a qualitative variable. Qualitative research doesn't use variables, so this is just quantitative research. And the most basic variables that are in a quantitative study are the independent variable and the dependent variable, and a lot of students get those confused. The way that I remember it is that the dependent variable depends on the independent variable.
I was following the pack, all swallowed in their coats, with scarves of red tied round their throats, to keep their little heads from falling in the snow, and I turned round and there you go.
For me, that helps me remember that the dependent variable is the one that we observe, and the independent variable is the one that's manipulated. Another way you can remember it is the acronym ID or ID, if you're Freudian, or else, the thing that you show to get into the bar at night. So the most basic research study that you can do in quantitative research is looking at the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable, the IV and the DV. So basically what you're asking is, as the changes are observed in the IV, as the IV fluctuates, what's going on with the DV, dependent variable, right? So for example, if students spend more time studying, right, the independent variable, right, what happens to their grades? That's the dependent variable. But very often our world, it doesn't break down into these really direct connections between the independent variable and dependent variable, right? These direct relationships. There might be some sort of variable that comes in between them. These are called the mediating variables because they mediate or come between, the independent and the dependent variable. So what you'll see is that there are changes in the IV, the independent variable, that produce changes in the mediating variable, which in turn lead to changes in the dependent variable. So it's more of a chain of, or a sequence of cause and effect. So to give you an example of that, when students study more, that was our original independent variable, right? They feel more confident. That's our mediating variable, and it's the confidence, that directly produces the better test performance. Not necessarily the time spent studying. So maybe that's our hypothesis that we're going to want to test. So then finally, we have a moderating variable. Moderating variable is a little bit different from the mediating variable because it's not necessarily in between the variables, but it still affects the relationship between the variable. The presence or absence of the moderating variable can change the intensity of a relationship or whether or not it even happens at all, So in our previous example, we were saying that studying boosted the confidence in taking a test, which in turn resulted in higher test scores. But we might notice that the confidence is only boosted in those students who are already doing well in the class, and those that aren't doing well, doesn't matter how much they study, they still perform poorly, right? So the confidence then would be a moderating variable because it moderates the relationship between the independent variable, the studying, and the median variable, which is confidence. Apart from the independent and dependent variables, there are also different types of variable. So quantitative variables are variables that vary by degree. So anything that you can kind of measure on like a numeric scale, sort of like weight, age, 1, 2, 3, 4. Temperature is another one. Those are quantitative variables, or sometimes they're called numeric variables or continuous variables because they're, a continuum of numbers. Also, there are categorical variables which vary by type, so they don't necessarily have a numeric value to them. So something like city, or what city you're from, or color, gender, right? Those are categorical variables. There are different types. There's men and women, right? You might be from Chicago or Toronto or Miami or some other place, right? Now, what you need to keep in mind is that even though categorical variables are not numeric or continuous, quantitative researchers are still counting, right? That's what makes it quantitative research. Car color might be a categorical variable. You have blue, black, red, right? But you still count. I've got 6 blue cars and 3 black cars and 4 red cars. So those are the 2 different kinds of variables, right? And we're going to break it down into a little bit further a little later in the course. The textbook mentions transforming numeric and categorical variables. This can be a little tricky, so let's have a look at it. Most of you probably know that if you want to transform a quantitative variable into a categorical variable, all you need to do is kind of group the values, right? So let's say I did a survey and I'm looking at how many fish people caught during fishing season. I might decide that anything below 4 fish is just a little, right? I'm going to group 1, 2, 3, 4 as a little, or a few, right? And I might decide that anything above 12 fish is a lot, so 13, 14, 15, anything is a lot, and then in between I'll just call that average, right? So one thing you might notice in transforming the value from like a numeric to a categorical variable is that we've actually lost some information from the variable. I used to have a number of responses that ranged from 0 to, let's say, 23, right? Somebody caught like 23 fish. Now I just have 4 response categories, which is none, a few, average, and a lot, right? So I've actually kind of lost information from the way that I'm, from the data. And so that's okay. But here's where it gets problematic, right? Let's say I wanted to go the other way, right? I've sent out my survey and I've asked people, have you caught 0 fish, a few fish, average amount of fish, or a lot of fish, right? And people have responded back and however many they've caught. It's not possible for me from that information to figure out specifically how many fish each person has caught, right? Because a few fish could be anything from 1 to 4, right? I'm not sure where each person has said, like, is it 1? Is it 3? Right? It's just a few, right? So it's possible to reduce information, to go from a continuous variable to a categorical variable. It's not possible to produce information from nothing, right? It's not possible to switch from a categorical variable back to a continuous variable. It doesn't work that way. Where it gets tricky is that the textbook says that you kind of can transform categorical into quantitative or continuous variables. It's not really the same as the other transformation. What they say is that you can just assign numbers to the categories. So, like if I had none, then I might assign a 0 to that, and if I had a little, then I might assign 1 to that. This process is called dummy coding, right? It's really useful for doing like data entry. That's very helpful. But we need to be very careful about how we treat that data. The thing to remember there is that these numbers that we've assigned don't actually have any mathematical value, right? What they are symbols for the categories. So let's say we take a question about religion, for example. Logically, it's a categorical variable. You have, Christians and Hindus and Buddhists and Muslims and atheists, right? And we can demicode those. We can say 1 equals Christian, 2 equals Hindu, 3 equals Buddhist, 4 equals Muslim, and 5 equals atheist. But when we start to do analysis on our data, right, we can't say that 1 Muslim is equal to 2 Hindus, right? The same way that we would say 2 times 2 is 4. Or that a Christian and a Muslim, if we add them together, are equivalent to an atheist, like we would say 4 plus 1 equals 5. That doesn't make any sense and would probably offend quite a few people, so we're not going to do that, right? Unfortunately, you see this problem come up a lot in research that uses Likert scales, If you have extreme disagreement, then you select 1, and if you have extreme agreement, you select 5, and if you're neutral, you're 3, right? You've seen these before. Well, one person's strongly agree is not necessarily equal to another person's strongly agree, the way that 5 is equal to 5 all the time, right? They're not mathematically congruent. So these scales can be analyzed appropriately, but you need to have a lot of caution, especially if you see one in a research study. You should ask yourself, are the researchers actually treating the numbers appropriately? Okay, so next up we have correlation and causation. One of the mantras that you should be repeating to yourself, basically every night before you go to bed and every morning when you wake up, is correlation does not equal causation. Correlation does not equal causation. Correlation does not equal causation. Okay? Just because you see a relationship between a couple of variables doesn't mean that one caused the other. There are 3 criteria that are needed to determine causation. First of all, you need a systematic variance of the dependent variable with changes in the independent variable, right? You need to see that when one changes, the other also changes, and it does so in a regular way, right? Secondly, you need temporal precedence of the independent variable before the dependent variable. You need to see that the independent variable comes first, right, before the dependent variable changes. If it's the other way around, right, then you don't have temporal precedence. You're not sure which is causing which. And then third, right, is that there's a lack of plausible, explanations that are alternate to causation, right? And this includes chance, right, that things are just happening randomly through chance. Now, a correlational study will address the first point, that there is a relationship that happens. There's systematic variance of the independent variable and the dependent variable. But sometimes it's not very good at addressing the second, that temporal precedence. You can't tell which one comes first, is it chicken or egg, right? And then it usually fails to address the third, about the lack of plausible alternate explanations, because there's not a lot of control in a correlational study, right? There are other variables that might come in there and better explain it, or at least equally explain it. The book notes that there's a strength between correlations. It's usually expressed as the letter R. And that ranges from 0, which is like there's no relationship, to 1, which is there's a perfect relationship. Positive correlation means that the values follow the same direction. As IV rises, so does the DV. And the negative correlation indicates an opposite direction. So as IV rises, the DV actually falls, the direct variable, the dependent variable falls. Alright, so before we finish the chapter, let's just really, really briefly touch on qualitative research. We're going to come back to it in a lot more depth later on. But in my experience, students are mostly familiar with quantitative research, like the scientific method and everything. In many cases, that's probably how a lot of you think about research. in general. That's your paradigm right now. The idea of qualitative research, probably a little bit hazy for a lot of you at this point. But as I said, at the beginning of this chapter, it's important to approach each paradigm on its own terms. And so we've been talking about quantitative research right now, and the best thing to do is kind of put that out of your mind or compartmentalize it when you start thinking about qualitative research, because it's very different. This is not quantitative research. When you start thinking about quantitative research, probably the best place to start actually would be you might try watching some of these documentaries. I'm going to post a list of documentaries here. Of course, not every documentary can be considered qualitative research. Of course, there are some differences between the rigor of most academic qualitative work and the values that sort of drive a commercial film that's being shown for audiences for a profit. So you should be aware of those as well. They're not always designed necessarily to provide dependable knowledge that we can rely on necessarily as to bring in box office earning. But that said, these movies may be a good place to start in thinking about qualitative research. So what is qualitative research? Well, at the heart of it, we're looking for subjective lived experiences of participants. We're interested in how they perceive and understand the world, how they make meaning or make sense of everything, and the processes that they use to negotiate challenges in their lives, and the stories that they have to tell about that. There are three primary means of collecting data in qualitative research. Primarily you have interviews, observations, and documents or other artifacts that might also provide you with information such as letters or reports or pictures or movies, or videos, music, receipts, so on. On the other hand, even though there's just sort of a few ways that data is collected, there are many, many, many ways of doing sort of analysis on that data. You can come from a number of different perspectives and do a lot of different creative stuff with it. So there are 5 approaches that are described by the text. There are more than 5 approaches in qualitative research, but these are kind of the main big ones. Phenomenology examines the essence of the experience of a phenomenon. What is this phenomenon about? What makes it? Ethnography is a study of cultures. We don't necessarily study, culture so much as like subculture. So, the subculture of a school or maybe the subculture of a particular group of society. Those seem to be more interesting to modern ethnographers. Narrative inquiry assumes that people's lives are storied and investigates how those stories are constructed and how they function socially. Case study involves sort of a specific or bounded system for studying, so something that's like a specific person or place or like an organization or an event. Those are all cases that can be studied. To give you kind of a contrast, phenomenology is more of a general examination of an experience. So they're a little bit different. Grounded theory is used to generate what they call low-level theories, basically just explaining what's happening in a process or a phenomenon. These can often stand alone as their own findings. Sometimes they're used to inform quantitative studies. They become hypotheses that can be tested. So that's a really, really, really brief overview of like the big 3 methodologies: quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods. And we're going to come back to each of these, and we're going to get really, really in depth with both of those. And so if there's something that's maybe not making sense right now or sort of a little bit ambiguous for you right now, it'll probably be clarified throughout the course, a little bit later. So stay tuned. All right.